Washington, and it's been a real pleasure.
All right, sir. Thank you very much. That does it for today's Washington Journal. We'll, of course, be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, live coverage of the House here on C-SPAN.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House communications from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., February 6, 2014. I hereby appoint the Honorable Doc Hastings to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Monsignor Stephen Rossetti of the St. Luke Institute in Washington, D.C.
O God, you are the Lord of heaven and earth, yet you are humble, and it is your delight to serve us, your beloved children. We pray that we too might have that same spirit of humility and a deep desire to serve. May we be especially mindful of those who are struggling, those who are suffering, and those who are poor. You have a special love for them. May we have that same love. We thank you for being the humble, loving God that you are. May we become more like you, loving, humble, serving. We pray this in your holy name. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved.
Mr. Speaker.
What purpose the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal.
The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, Wednesday in a congressional hearing under oath, Michael Bonicelli, the Deputy Director of the Office of Drug Control Policy, could not answer my direct questions. What's more dangerous, methamphetamine or marijuana? How many people died from marijuana last year? He complained that people think marijuana is benign. Well, I don't think marijuana is benign, but I can understand how people can get confused when so-called experts cannot give straight answers. And federal law says that marijuana is more dangerous than cocaine and methamphetamines, which everybody knows is a lie. Unlike marijuana, tobacco use is falling. Unlike marijuana, we don't lock up, we don't arrest millions of people for using tobacco. Tobacco use has been cut almost 2/3 because we've been honest about the facts. Maybe there's a lesson for our drug policy officials. If you want to discourage marijuana use, be honest and be direct.
What purpose, the gentleman from Massachusetts rise? Without objection. The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to talk about a piece of legislation that I have introduced to boost our economy, invest in our crumbling infrastructure, and create jobs. The economy is in need of a jolt, the proverbial shot in the arm, to get it moving again. The need for this legislation is clear. Our unemployment rate is too high, the number of jobs created too low, and income inequality has made our recovery uneven at best. 8 million jobs were wiped out during the recession. We have to get them back. I've introduced the Invest in Us Act, the Invest in the U.S. Act. My legislation will go a long way toward helping the economy take off again. It makes strategic investments in infrastructure, bond measures, wildly successful Build America bonds programs, makes the R&D tax credit permanent, and many other tax credit initiatives. The Invest in the U.S. Act also takes full aim at rising income inequality. It increases the minimum wage, provides tax relief for small businesses that hire new employees and those that buy new equipment. The American people want one thing: an improved economy and more jobs. Join me in supporting this legislation that will finance critical infrastructure investments, fight income inequality, and grow our economy. The argument is about jobs.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Climate change, offshore drilling, wildfires, water scarcity, these concerns are expressed over and over again from my constituents in my district. People are anxious that the world they are handing down to their children is not as pristine as the one they inherited. They plead with us to protect the environment. And yet, time and again, the House majority votes to undercut clean air and water laws while blocking efforts to protect public lands. What a travesty when allegiance to industry takes precedence over maintaining a healthy environment. This week, We wasted precious floor time with needless bills, like the Sacramento-San Joaquin Emergency Water Delivery Act, which made a mockery of the serious drought in California. The House needs to stop bringing irresponsible bills to the floor, giving away our cherished lands and stripping away environmental protections and doing nothing to solve real problems like the drought in California. We've heard their excuses. They say environmental regulations slow the economy, but let's be honest. Putting the interests of corporations above our environment is a dangerously expensive notion. Let's stop being reactionary and get ahead of these real problems facing our planet.
Gentlelady's time's expired. For what purposes, gentlewoman from Hawaii seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, long-term unemployment has not been this high in this great country since World War II. It is time to look back in our history and see what the leaders did then. We can always learn from the past. In 1944, the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His vision was to expand economic opportunity, jobs. To build the middle class, we must rebuild and help them thrive and fight inequality. Mr. Speaker, how about beginning with women? Today, we have more than 50 million people, 13 million of them are children, living below poverty in this country. We have the greatest economy in the world. This is absolutely shameful. We must adopt and be committed to the concept of full employment. Take up the President's America Jobs Act of 2013. Rebuild this country's infrastructure. Invest in education, in our first responders, and in medical researchers. This is time to put America first and make it in America. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
From what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2954.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 472 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2954. The Chair appoints the gentleman from California, Mr. Denham, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2954, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to authorize Escambia County, Florida, to convey certain property that was formerly part of Santa Rosa Island National Monument and that was conveyed to Escambia County subject to restrictions on use and reconveyance.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 30 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the Public Access and Lands Improvement Act, H.R. 2954, is a bipartisan package of 10 bills to protect and promote public access to lands, to improve opportunities by removing red tape that stands in the way of responsible local economic development and jobs, and to encourage transparent, community-centered land management. This small grouping of bills will advance important local projects that will have a direct impact on jobs and on economic growth in communities throughout the country. The package includes several common-sense land conveyance bills to remove unnecessary bureaucratic strings attached to how land is used and how it's managed. It recognizes that locally elected leaders, not federal bureaucrats, know how to best manage certain lands. There are measures to prevent unreasonable federal regulations or actions from destroying a historic lookout tower in my home state of Washington, blocking unreasonable public recreation access to the Cape Hatteras Seashore in North Carolina, and preventing the use of hand-powered boats such as kayaks in several national parks in the West. This bill will help family businesses and ranchers by implementing common-sense reforms to the process of renewing livestock grazing permits. Livestock grazing on federal lands is an important part of the American ranching tradition. This bill will help our nation's ranchers operate more efficiently and with greater certainty. And the package, Mr. Chairman, also includes legislation sponsored by the Public Lands Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Bishop of Utah, requiring the BLM to establish an interstate database for all BLM lands that are available for sale to the public. In the year 2014, if I may be parochial, when a Seahawks fan can purchase a championship hat on the Internet just moments after the Super Bowl ends, the federal government can certainly get its act together and post its lands that are available for sale online. This bill will expedite the planning and implementation of emergency salvage timber sales for federal lands in California that were ravaged by the Rim Fire last summer. Without prompt emergency action, the impacts of this devastating wildfire could become even worse. Fire-damaged trees invite disease, they invite insect infestations, they increase the risk of future wildfires, and they are a threat to visitor safety. Emergency salvage and forest restoration efforts should not be delayed due to bureaucratic hurdles and lawsuits. And finally, the bill provides for transparency and accountability on how federal funds are spent in protecting the Chesapeake Bay. This small package of bills is reasonable, responsible, and it reflects the will of local communities and their elected leaders. It deserves support, I believe, from my Democrat and Republican colleagues. Now, before concluding my remarks on this piece of legislation and listening to the statement from the gentleman from Arizona, I'd like to briefly address the legislative work of this committee as a whole. And the committee, of course, I speak of is the Natural Resources Committee. Just this week, the House will have considered 3 measures from the House Natural Resources Committee. 2 of these packages were individual bills, which means a total of 18 different bills from this committee will have effectively been considered and debated and voted upon by the House this week. Prior to this week, over the first 13 months of this Congress, the Natural Resources Committee has advanced nearly 60 individual bills through the House. Nearly 50 of those bills have passed on a broad, bipartisan basis under the expedited suspension process. 10 bills under the jurisdiction of the committee, both Republican and Democrat, have been signed by the President, which represents a noticeable percentage of the public laws that have been enacted by this Congress. These totals do not include individual bills, including in other measures such as bills that were included in the Defense Authorization Act. Now, Mr. Chairman, this statement is not made as a pat on the back, but to make clear that the intent of this committee is to dutifully work and act on priorities for our nation. They may be narrow bills to resolve parochial problems or broad measures affecting the country as a whole. And of course, the nature of our committee is to deal with, in many cases, bills that deal on very parochial issues. That's one of the reasons why there are so many bills that come out of our committee. In matters of broad policy, there are of great urgency, such as the importance of restoring responsible active forest management, and to both support economically struggling rural communities and improve the health of federal forests. We did pass that bill earlier this year. And just yesterday, the House moved swiftly to provide a solution to the devastating drought in California. We've also acted on multiple bipartisan measures to streamline red tape and boost America's ability to safely harness our vast energy resources to create jobs, because we know that energy jobs are good-paying jobs, to lower prices and to strengthen our national security by reducing dependence on foreign energy from hostile nations. On each of these measures, it's time for the Senate to act and to pass their own proposals so that we can then work to reach an agreement If there are the necessary, obviously there will be differences between both houses, but they need to pass their legislation so we can work on the differences so that these measures can become law. We have differences, but we have a responsibility to represent those who are elected to serve and put forward real solutions for the challenges facing the American people. And there are dozens of bills solving local problems, implementing locally supported solutions, and establishing protections for historic and special places that can be acted on by both the House and the Senate. I believe that this is possible on matters under the jurisdiction of the Natural Resources Committee, that we can find common ground with the Senate. Now, why do I say that? Because we've successfully done so repeatedly over this last year. That's why there are a noticeable number of public laws from our committees that have been acted on by the House and have gone to the President. But, as always, this will require willingness to recognize and respect differences in philosophy and procedure in both the House and in the Senate. And it must be a two-way street where each chamber acts on its own priorities. But again, this has successfully been done in the past, and I know it can be done in the future. The Republican majority in the House has demonstrated our willingness to do so while maintaining our fundamental views on federal land management, the importance of multiple use of public lands, and the ability of local communities to make better decisions for themselves than the federal bureaucracy. So as we conclude this week's full slate of action on House Natural Resource Committee bills, I pledge to continue working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the Capitol to make progress in the days, weeks, and months ahead. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And let me congratulate the chairman on the Seahawks, and also remind him that there was a long 16-game season. They won their division. They played San Francisco 3 times, 2 out of 3. And then after that, they went into the playoffs. And then after the playoffs, they went to the championship game, and finally to the Super Bowl, which they won. Congratulations. So it's great that you got that cap 1 minute after the game was over. I'm pointing out that there was a long, deliberate process with rules, games to be won, that encompassed the whole season. And sometimes us rushing legislation is cutting corners that great championship teams like the Seahawks never do. Let me, if I may, Mr. Speaker, yield to my colleague, Mr. Cartwright from Pennsylvania, 5 minutes. I'll have more to say on the specifics of this legislation later.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank Mr. Grijalva, the gentleman from Arizona. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to express my opposition to H.R. 2954, this mistitled Public Access and Lands Improvement Act. Rather than improving our nation's lands, this bill negatively affects our land management decisions. It conveys or disposes of federal lands improperly. It rewrites grazing policy. And it waives numerous environmental laws like the Natural Environmental Policy Act, the Wilderness Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Overall, H.R. 2954 contains a number of provisions that would undermine the responsible balance of interests and considerations in the stewardship of our nation's lands and our nation's resources. Included in the myriad of poor land management provisions that this bill cobbles together is language that gives away thousands of acres of federal land in Florida, Alaska, and Nevada, valued at millions of dollars without a transparent public planning process. When the federal government gives away land, we do so with certain understandings of how it will be used. It is just wrong to change the rules without due consideration and without any compensation for the federal government, the taxpayers of this nation, if others will now profit from this land. In yet another ill-advised land management provision, H.R. 2954 also prevents the Bureau of Land Management from carrying out its mission to manage public lands for multiple use. Specifically, this bill requires that until the agency creates a public database of all lands identified for disposal, BLM would be barred from all land acquisitions. This is couched as a transparency measure, when in reality it's nothing more than an attempt to prevent and delay BLM from doing its all-important work. Further, provisions of the bill would disregard or reduce public engagement on a range of community interests, including natural resource protections. In fact, H.R. 2954 would overturn a multi-year National Park Service process that has resulted in balanced provisions that protect threatened shorebirds and endangered nesting sea turtles while preserving the economic health of the community at Cape Hatteras National Seashore. The National Park Service should be allowed to continue their balanced and successful management of Cape Hatteras National Seashore in order to assure these critical protections remain in place. Along with these poor land management decisions and irresponsible consideration of our nation's lands and natural resources, H.R. 2954 would eliminate or delay timely reviews of grazing leases necessary to ensure sound conservation principles. In addition, 2954 includes a bill to expedite salvage logging on the rimfire area of Northern California, overriding NEPA and administrative and judicial review. The end result, after piecing together all these provisions, is a piece of legislation that waives federal law, including laws that require consultation with federal, state, local, or tribal governments or with local residents in order, among other things, to expedite timber harvests on certain federal lands in California, reverse course on the science-based National Park Service plan that provides an appropriate balance of off-road vehicle access and protection of sensitive seashore areas in North Carolina, and waive NEPA in multiple scenarios, weakening important public involvement in planning provisions. Mr. Chairman, our public lands and natural resources would simply be mismanaged, unprotected, and undervalued as a result of this bill. I believe we have to put partisan politics aside and work together to protect and responsibly manage America's natural resources and to support and ensure that the nation's spectacular landscapes, unique natural life, and cultural resources and icons endure for future generations. This bill is just a giant step in the wrong direction, and Mr. Chairman, for all these reasons, I urge my colleagues here in the House to vote no on H.R. 2954, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, who is the author of one of the titles of the bill.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for yielding, and particularly want to thank him for his work on the Natural Resources Committee and for his invaluable assistance on this bill. This summer, the biggest fire in the history of the Sierra Nevada mountains burned 400 square miles of forest land. The fire left behind an unprecedented swath of environmental devastation that threatens the loss not only of the affected forest land for generations to come, but sets events in motion that could destroy the surrounding forests for many years to come. The fire also left behind hundreds of millions of board feet of dead timber that's on federal land that could be sold to raise millions of dollars, money that could then be used to replant and reforest our devastated lands. In addition, processing that timber would help to revive the economy of a stricken region. But time is already running out. Within a year, the value of the timber declines rapidly as the wood is devoured by insects and rot. And that's the problem. Cumbersome environmental reviews and litigation that inevitably follows will run out the clock on this valuable asset until it becomes absolutely worthless. Indeed, it becomes worse than worthless. It becomes hazardous. Bark and wood-boring beetles are already moving in to feast on the dead and dying timber, and a population explosion of pestilence can be expected if these dead trees remain. And the beetles won't confine themselves to the fire areas, posing a mortal threat to the adjacent forests. By the time the normal bureaucratic reviews and lawsuits have run their course, what was once forest land will already begin converting to brush land, and by the following year, reforestation will become infinitely more difficult and expensive. Within just a few years, several feet of dry brush will build up, and the smaller trees will have begun toppling on this tinder. It is not possible to build a more perfect fire stack than that. That means that intense second-generation fires will take advantage of this fuel, sterilizing the soil, eroding the landscape, fouling the watersheds, and jeopardizing surrounding forests. Without timely salvage and reforestation, we know the fate of the Sierra because we've seen the result of neglect after previous fires. The trees don't come back for many, many generations. Instead, thick brush takes over the land that was once shaded by towering forests. It quickly overwhelms any seedlings struggling to make a start. It replaces the diverse ecosystems supported by the forests with scrub brush. Well, for this reason, I introduced H.R. 3188, which waives the time-consuming environmental review process and prevents the endless litigation that always follows. It authorizes federal forest managers following well-established environmental protocols for salvage to sell the dead timber and to supervise its careful removal while there's still time. The hundreds of millions of dollars raised can then be directed toward replanting the region before layers of brush choke off any chance of forest regrowth in the foreseeable future. Pardon me, the millions of dollars. It was modeled on legislation authored by Democratic Senator Tom Daschle for salvaging dead and dying trees in the Black Hills National Forest, a measure credited with speeding the preservation and recovery of that forest. Unfortunately, the bill spawned lurid tales from the activist left of uncontrolled logging in the Sierras. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. The legislation vested full control of the salvage plans with federal forest managers, not the logging companies. It left federal foresters in charge of enforcing salvage plans that fully protected the environment. But because of the opposition, and we heard just a little bit of it a moment ago, in a few minutes I'll offer an amendment that was worked out in consultation with the U.S. Forest Service and several Democratic offices, and I hope it will receive bipartisan support. It preserves the EIS process and the environmental and judicial reviews, but it expedites them and assures that salvage under the direction of the Forest Service can begin in this spring. There's plenty of room for compromise, but there is absolutely no excuse for inaction. The left wants a policy of benign neglect, to let 250,000 acres of destroyed timber rot in place, to salvage the ravaged land, to surrender the ravaged land to beetles, and to watch contentedly as the forest ecosystem is replaced by scrub brush. It's true, without human intervention, the forests will eventually return, about a century from now, but certainly not in the lifetimes of ourselves, our children, or our children's children. If we want to stop the loss of this forest land, and if we want to control the beetle infestation before it explodes out of control, the dead timber has to come out soon.
I yield. Gentleman, additional minute.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized for one more minute.
If we take it out now, we can generate the funds necessary to suppress brush buildup, plant new seedlings, and restore these forests for the use of and enjoyment of our children. If we wait for the normal bureaucratic reviews and litigation and delays, we will have lost these forests for the next several generations. The irony is 16,000 acres of that same forest were destroyed but are on private land. The owner, Sierra Pacific Industries, is in the process of salvaging the timber on their lands. They'll be done by this summer, and then they will begin reforesting from a portion of those proceeds. Meanwhile, the public lands lay unattended. And let me tell you something, within a couple of years, the difference is going to be dramatic. We will have fully salvaged and reforested private lands next to neglected, overgrown public lands that are dry with scrub brush and just waiting for the next fire. The public management of our lands will be judged in comparison with the management of the private lands. And if we
Gentleman's time's
maintain
expired.
current law, we will have been held in the balance and found wanting.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as she may consume to Ms. Delbany from Washington.
The gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today with great frustration and must oppose the Public Access and Lands Improvement Act in its current form. This bill is a merger of 10 public lands and natural resource bills, all of which are unrelated to each other, and many of which would ignore the best available science, compromise the stewardship of our public lands, and completely disregard the bedrock environmental laws that have served to protect our environment and cherished open spaces for decades. That being said, there is one part of the bill that I do support. Buried in Title VI of this bill is the Green Mountain Lookout Heritage Protection Act, which I introduced with Congressman Larson and Senators Murray and Cantwell. Green Mountain Lookout, located in the Glacier Peak Wilderness, was built in 1933 as a civilian conservation corps project to detect fires and spot enemy aircraft during World War II. The lookout is an important, historic, and unique part of the Pacific Northwest, and it's a popular destination for hikers and is listed on the National Register for Historic Places. Unfortunately, severe weather caused the Green Mountain Lookout to fall into disrepair in 2001, and the U.S. Forest Service began taking steps to preserve the historic structure for future generations. However, an out-of-state group filed a lawsuit against the Forest Service for using machinery to conduct these repairs, and unfortunately, a U.S. District Court ordered the Forest Service to remove the lookout. My bill would allow critical and routine maintenance while keeping this iconic structure where it's meant to be, in its original home. Local governments in the area, my constituents, as well as a number of environmental and historic preservation groups, support my bill to keep the Green Mountain Lookout where it is. And the Natural Resources Committee agrees. They passed this bill unanimously last year, and why wouldn't they? This bill is common sense. It saves us money because it would actually cost more to remove the lookout than to keep it where it is. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that if this bill had been brought up on its own, by its own merits, it would have passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening here today. Instead, this bill's gotten wrapped up with a series of very controversial and divisive bills. The Green Mountain Lookout represents a significant piece of the Pacific Northwest history, and it deserves to be protected for outdoor enthusiasts to enjoy for years to come. It does not deserve to be wrapped up in a package of bills that we all know will be dead on arrival in the Senate. The administration has also voiced its support for the Green Mountain Lookout, keeping it where it is, while strongly opposing the rest of this bill. Green Mountain deserves a vote on its own, and I'm extremely disappointed that my amendment to separate my bill from the rest of this package was denied a chance to be considered today. The way this piece of legislation was handled is emblematic of the dysfunction that's so prevalent and so unnecessary in Congress today. The people of Washington State expect Congress to make progress, and they expect compromise, not partisan exercises that won't make it to the President's desk or achieve a meaningful result. I'm deeply disappointed that that's where this bill is today, and I know that many of my constituents are as well. It's my hope that I'll be able to work with my colleagues from across the aisle to consider the Green Mountain Lookout Heritage Protection Act before it's too late. The need for immediate action is great because if the lookout is moved once, there's no moving it back. It's simple. Taking care of our environment is critical to protecting the quality of life that we cherish. I cannot in good conscience support this overall bill due to the many other harmful measures that are included in this package. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Labrador, who is an author of one of the titles of the bill.
The gentleman from Idaho is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of Title VIII of H.R. 2954, which I originally introduced as H.R. 657, the Grazing Improvement Act. I thank Chairman Hastings for recognizing the importance of this issue and including it in H.R. 2954 for consideration today. Livestock grazing is an important part of the rich ranching tradition in Idaho and the United States. My home state of Idaho produces some of the world's finest lamb and beef. Food production is a major part of Idaho's history and is an integral part of our cultural fabric and our economic security. These traditions are under attack, and we must preserve them for future generations. The financial security of ranchers depends upon the responsible stewardship of the land. Unfortunately, the federal process to review the permits which allow them to produce food has become severely backlogged due to lawsuits aimed at eliminating livestock from public lands. The local federal land managing offices cannot keep up with the pace of litigation and the endless environmental analysis. This diverts the already limited resources from these offices and leaves ranchers at risk of losing their grazing permits and jeopardizing their livelihoods. Agriculture is a challenging way to make a living, but producers choose this path because it is their passion and it is their way of life. Several ranchers in my state of Idaho have said that if they were to lose their grazing permit, they would have to subdivide their land and further reduce their grazing areas. My bill, the Grazing Improvement Act, would provide relief to these ranchers and to ranchers throughout the country. It would, number one, extend livestock grazing permits from 10 to 20 years in order to give producers adequate longevity and production stability. It would also codify existing appropriation language to put into statute annual riders, and it would encourage the respective Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to utilize categorical exclusions to expedite permit processing. I believe that protecting our environment can be done in a manner that does not impede our economic growth. It is time that we improve our regulatory structure so that we continue to prosper as a nation. We can no longer allow the federal government to maintain an enormous backlog in processing grazing permits. I thank the co-sponsors of this legislation, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 2954 is another attempt to weaken landmark environmental protections, dictate land management decisions, convey and dispose of federal land, and rewrite a grazing policy. This chamber once again will spend a day debating bad policy put forth by the majority, who seem to work tirelessly to undermine the progress of the last centuries Americans have made in conservation and environmental protection. Undeterred by reality or a desire by the American people for a bipartisan legislation and compromise. Furthermore, Republicans have long criticized the omnibus bills as an affront to regular order, but now attempt to force this bill of bad policy proposals through the House that has no chance of passing the Senate. And let me quote from the statement from the White House that in opposition, the White House strongly opposes the bill, and the statement says, overall, H.R. 2954 contains a number of provisions that would undermine the responsible balance of interest and considerations in stewardship of the nation's lands and natural resources. It also goes on to state, provisions of the bill would disregard or reduce public engagement on a range of community interests, including natural resource protections, and preclude agencies from considering less environmental detrimental alternatives. The statement cited the provisions in the bill that would waive all federal laws and consultation requirements, and that would now initiate a timber sale without those. They would eliminate the balanced limitation on off-road vehicle use within the Cape Hatteras recreation area and waive environmental review requirements for grazing activities on federal land. The White House said it could support provisions that would restore the Green Mountain Lookout in Washington State and modify conservation programs at Chesapeake Bay watershed. Overall, this legislation is going nowhere and has no chance of ever becoming law. But here we are. Furthermore, Republicans have long criticized, even though we could be working together on a variety of public land issues that need to be addressed, like the reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, we instead are debating a package of bills that fails to address significant issues that have bipartisan solutions. In fact, we can work together on some of the individual titles in this bill as standalones. We are not legislating, we are wasting valuable time, and it's clear why the American people have such a negative view of Congress. Let me review quickly the substance of the package. Title I would extinguish the reversionary clause covering property in Santa Rosa Island in Florida. The reversionary clause requires that the property in question be used for public purposes, since federal land is for the American public in its entirety. And what's the reason for rescinding the clause? So that the County of Escamilla can dredge and build a harbor that would cut off access to the rest of the island, most of which is managed as part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore and a unit of the National Park Service. Title II and III are much of the same federal land grabs to be used for windfall profits at the expense of the American people. Title III goes further by waiving a number of laws, including the Endangered Species Act, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Title IV would prevent the BLM from carrying out its mission to manage public lands for multiple use until the agency creates a public database of all lands identified for disposal. BLM would be barred from all land acquisitions until such database is created. BLM is currently used as a public process developed and implemented locally through resource management plans and approved by Congress to identify parcels for acquisition or disposal. This measure would just add another extreme layer of bureaucracy. Title V would threaten endangered nesting shorebirds and sea turtles in the Cape Hatteras National Seashore Recreation Area. In 2007, the National Park Service placed modest limits on the use of off-highway vehicles on the beaches in order to limit the impacts of on these species. The National Park Service was sued, and a judge determined the limits were inadequate protection for the endangered species. In arbitration, the parties, including all stakeholders, agreed on a new plan that provided adequate protection for endangered species while allowing managed off-highway vehicle access. This measure would require the seashore be managed under the first rule rather than the agreed-upon settlement. Title VIII would change grazing tenure from 10 to 20 years and provide environmental waivers for grazing permit renewals, reissuance, or transfers. If we are going to reform grazing permit tenure, we should also talk about those ranchers who would like to get out of the business and retire their permits. Also, address the low cost of grazing on federal lands. Grazing fees have not changed since 1996 and are significantly lower than in the past, while state and private landowners generally seek market value for grazing. This measure is completely unbalanced and fails to address significant grazing issues. Title IX, like many other natural resource measures proposed by the Republicans, waives NEPA, judicial review, and administrative review, completely disregarding the input of critical stakeholders such as the general public. In conclusion, this so-called lands package should be called the Federal Lands Giveaway, Destruction of Protected Species, and the Lack of Accountability Act. This package undermines the management of our public lands, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. The bill we are considering this morning includes a provision that would repeal excessive restrictions on public access to Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Even though the seashore is paid for by tax dollars, current regulations have restricted access to the recreational area that is owned by the taxpayer. The elected officials of Dare County have verified that the regulations have damaged the economy in the area, which relies heavily on tourism. The last thing that we need in eastern North Carolina and across the country is government regulations stifling job creation and economic growth. This bill would overturn the current rule restricting access to the seashore and reinstitute the National Park Service 2007 Interim Management Strategy to govern visitor access and species protection at Cape Hatteras. The interim strategy was backed by a 113-page biological opinion issued by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, which found that it would not jeopardize piping plover, sea turtles, or other species of concern. Let me repeat that very quickly. The interim strategy was backed by a 113-page biological opinion issued by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, which found that it would not jeopardize piping plover, sea turtle, or other species of concern. Please support this legislation. Let's protect the species that need to be protected, but let's also protect the rights of the taxpayer. This bill finds the balance between the two, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and author of one of the titles of the bill.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I do want to say that this is has a simple solution to a very important property rights issue in northwest Florida. Pursuant to 1947 federal deed, Escambia County, Florida, was given authority to transfer property on Santa Rosa Island, but could not issue title to that land. Instead, the county began leasing the property to individuals who could pay a lease fee instead of being charged a property tax. Now, in the years since 1947, Pensacola Beach and Navarre Beach have grown into bustling communities and fine tourist destinations. Additionally, numerous pending cases in the judicial system seek to allow local authorities to levy taxes now on those properties that currently are being leased. As a result of these developments, local stakeholders, including both boards of commissioners of Escambia and Santa Rosa County, asked me to introduce this piece of legislation. Mr. Chairman, this is a fairness issue. It will allow leaseholders the option of attaining fee simple title to their property while also protecting current agreements governing conservation, preservation, public access, and recreation. Additionally, the bill would help ease management of the island by allowing conveyance of certain land currently owned by Escambia County to Santa Rosa County. Now, it's important to note that the bill does not address the issue of property taxes on those properties. It simply seeks to permit leaseholders the option to attain title to their property so that leaseholders and local governments can jointly address any local tax issues that may arise in the future. Contrary to a statement released by the White House yesterday, this bill does not remove any protections from Santa Rosa Island. Rather, it restates those protections that are currently in place with Santa Rosa County and Escambia County that is critical to this barrier island. I also want to take note that this bill in no way affects the right to public beach access, nor does it change the boundaries of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, nor does it negatively impact the mission of the National Park Service. And contrary to what the ranking member said, Escambia County has absolutely no intention of dredging a bay. This is not going to happen.
30 seconds to jump.
This is not going to happen. Escambia County is protected on both sides of the land that they have currently now under lease by the National Park Service, the Gulf Island National Seashore, so I urge all of my colleagues to support this common sense bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
It should be, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It should be noted for the record that National Park Service provided a series of recommendations to make this portion of the legislation workable, and those were not considered during the process. Absolutely.
The National Park Service, if they said Escambia County was doing this because they had an intent of doing some type of a dredging project, they're absolutely incorrect.
Well, reclaiming my time, this land to be used for public purposes, and this is public land, not land to give away, and as stated before over and over again, then to be dredged and used for a harbor for potential windfall profit. Not only that, this action completely disregards the conservation goals of the adjacent national seashore by hindering access. On one hand, we talk about limited access to public lands. On the other, we hinder access to those places we see fit. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to gentleman from Utah, subcommittee chairman and also author of one of the titles of the bill.
The gentleman from Utah is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by talking about some things that have been overstated on parts, especially the one that is my title. My title does not stop the BLM or anybody in the Interior Department from doing multiple use on the land. It has nothing to do with management. It simply says they can buy no new land until they first become transparent and provide a database that anyone can easily accomplish. As with some of the other statements that have been made on the floor, some of them are somewhat exaggerated from what this bill intends to do. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me talk about this bill as an entity. There is a common thread that runs through this bill that deals with public lands and people from Florida to Alaska and all stations in between. What we simply have found is the federal government has large centralized bureaucracies that do our land management process that no longer meet the needs of people, but rather they hide behind rules and policies and regulations which makes them safe for them. But they don't actually help people, which requires sometimes to be flexible and think outside the proverbial box. The island in Florida that Mr. Miller was just referring to was given by Florida to the government. The government gave it back to Florida before I was born, and that is not that's been a while. But the concept here is that the government does not own this land, they don't need it, they don't use it, but they still wish to control it. It doesn't matter why, they still do, and there is no purpose for that. It is ludicrous that the congressman from Alaska must come down here and write a law to transfer 3 acres of land in Anchorage back to the city of Anchorage so it can be used to benefit the people of Anchorage. Again, land the federal government does not longer own, they don't need, they don't use, but they still wish in some way to control it. The grazers in Idaho, who produce the stuff from which Big Macs and Whoppers are made, and I know that from personal experience, obviously, only wanted to be treated fairly and with consistently and with consideration for the needs so they can be successful in their trade. Kayakers in Wyoming simply want the ability to recreate on an area that was designed for recreation without being specifically prohibited by rules and regulations that were to insist and support a policy that we have found no longer is necessary and does not work. Now, if these 10 bills were to pass, unfortunately, it doesn't solve all our problems, because all these 10 bills do is show a tip of the proverbial iceberg of the problems that we face in dealing with land management when it comes from a large, centralized bureaucracy, and we no longer put our primary interest in helping people meet their needs. The Speaker, when the Berlin Wall fell down, the entire world realized that large, centralized bureaucracies of the communist world failed.
I yield the gentleman 1 additional minute.
Eastern Europe learned that. Entrepreneurs learned that. They found that lean, aggressive companies simply take market share from the lumbering corporate products of the past. Everyone realized that a large, centralized bureaucratic program is ineffective except here in Washington, D.C., where we still address every problem with an effort to try and build something that's going to be controlled here in the center of all wisdom, that is large, that is centralized, that is bureaucratic. It is mind-boggling that the nation who defeated the Soviet Union with creativity and freedom still decides to solve all problems and all management issues by going back to a Soviet-styled agency program and concept. This bill is needed because it affects people throughout the length and the breadth of this country, and it's only the beginning of what we need to do to set it right and make sure that our highest priority is people, not rules and regulations. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle make fun of the fact the United States Congress has to be involved in such unimportant matters as the conveyance of federal land. Just as this great nation defeated the Soviet Union, and we allude to the fact that we have a Soviet-style centralized government with regard to land management in this country, I think that my colleagues need to take that up with the framers of the Constitution. Article 4 of that document states the Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. So I am sorry The majority finds this burdensome, but the framers apparently felt that federal property was valuable and that Congress should play a role in determining what to do with it. And let's be clear, we're talking here about federal property. That is property owned by all Americans. The land in question in Escambia County, Florida, Anchorage, Alaska, Fernley, Nevada, Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, Yellowstone, and Grand Teton, and the land on which federal grazing occurs. The land impacted by this package is federal land, owned by each and every American taxpayer. In the case of these land transfers, the federal government gave the land, gave it to a local community as a means of federal support, and the only requirement in most cases was that the land always be used for public purposes. As long as it's a park, or a school, or a fire station, it's yours for free. What these bills do is end those public purpose requirements. The communities want to use these lands for private profit. They want to close them to the public in many cases. This is not a land grab by Uncle Sam. This is not some silly scheme by the feds to harm local communities and to use their power to hold down the taxpayers and keep the public out. This is a community asking to make money off land that was owned by all Americans, and it is the job of Congress to decide if that is a good idea or not. And let's put one other misleading claim to rest. While Republicans claim the federal government owns too much land, the historic trend has been one of divestiture and fragmentation. As recently as the late 1860s, the federal government owned 1.8 billion of the 2.3 billion acres in the contiguous United States. Grants to states, homesteaders, land-grant colleges, railroads, and others settling in Alaska and the West have reduced federal land ownership by roughly 640 million acres today. We're not giving land away for centuries, not buying it up, and today we have a whole series of bills seeking more federal land that we own, that the American people own, to consider, and the American people require that we consider this carefully, and the Constitution requires that Congress be empowered to consider these carefully. These mischaracterizations are not helpful in the discussions. These bills are not in the best interest of the American people. On the merits alone, and using misinformation to claim otherwise is wrong, and I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, could I inquire how much time is on both sides?
The gentleman from Arizona has 9.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Washington has 5.5 minutes remaining.
I will advise my friend that at this point I have